The story you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, about innovation, and about the sheer force of human will when it refuses to kneel. Deep in West Africa, a young leader stood face to face with the most advanced economic warfare machine ever unleashed. Its purpose? To crush sovereign nations, to topple governments, to force proud people into silence and submission. But this time, the machine failed, and what rose from the shadows, crafted in makeshift basements and fueled by desperation, didn't just defy expectations, it rewrote the global playbook. Today, Western intelligence agencies still whisper the name Ibrahim Traoré, a name now stamped across classified briefings from Brussels to Langley. Why? Because what happened beneath the streets of Ouagadougou still sends tremors through boardrooms and war rooms alike. It all started with a decision made in the marble corridors of European power. In a high-level meeting, behind locked doors, and between sips of €30 espresso, a verdict was delivered. Isolate Burkina Faso. Starve it. Break its will. The young president had dared to think for himself, and that to them was unforgivable. "No bullets, no bombs," said one strategist, tapping manicured fingers on a leather folder. "We'll strangle them economically, cut defense funding, freeze parts shipments, shut down tech transfers." The others nodded. This was the same playbook that had worked in Libya, in Iraq, and Syria. Let their systems rot, let their armies crumble, let their people beg. But the architects of that strategy never looked beneath the surface. In a labyrinth of dimly lit workshops buried beneath the capital, far from embassies and TV cameras, a quiet rebellion was taking shape. Flickering bulbs hung from ceilings patched with wires and tape. Tables overflowed with broken radios, scavenged circuit boards, hand-drawn schematics. It wasn't Silicon Valley, but what lived there had more spirit than any billion-dollar R&D lab. President Ibrahim Traoré walked those narrow halls, not as a dignitary, but as one of them. No suits, no red carpets, just concrete, steel, and genius. Not imported, not bought, born right there in the soil of resistance. These weren't elite engineers. They were farmers who knew how to rebuild tractors from scrap. Mechanics who kept old engines alive without manuals, women who taught themselves to code from smuggled textbooks, typing on laptops held together with tape, powered by car batteries and sunlight. From nothing, they built everything. Their first creation? A prototype drone, raw, fragile, and beautiful. Power came from torn-down car batteries. Tubes from abandoned construction sites formed its skeletal frame. Its eyes? A stolen surveillance lens, once part of a French system. The irony wasn't lost on them. It was a Frankenstein machine stitched from history's leftovers. They called it Syrah, the path in their language. It flew for just 3 minutes, 2 kilometers. Grainy video, static-filled feed. But to those watching from the basement floor, it might as well have been the launch of a space shuttle. Because they had just done the impossible. They had turned rubble into resistance, junk into justice, imagination into independence. And that moment, quiet, shaky, untelevised, marked the beginning of something that would haunt global powers for years to come. President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his modest office, a room that bore no resemblance to the grand chambers of foreign heads of state. No chandeliers, no imported marble floors, no entourage of advisors in designer suits, just a plain wooden desk hand-carved by local craftsmen. Books worn from constant use lined the shelves. And on the wall, a single framed photograph, his grandmother, the woman who taught him that dignity was never bestowed by others. It was owned, lived, defended. "Mr. President," the chief engineer said, nearly breathless. "Sir, it's operational. We can fly, we can see, we can record." Traoré didn't smile, didn't call a press conference. No back-patting, no champagne, just a quiet nod. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What do we need to build 10 more?" The news spread not through cables or communiques, but through the same quiet networks that had carried resistance across Africa for generations. Word of mouth, encrypted messages, whispered names in dusty courtyards. A grainy photo of Sira mid-flight passed from phone to phone, igniting something deeper than hope: pride. Meanwhile, in the air-conditioned war rooms of defense contractors across Europe and America, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Laughter. Africans building drones? The punchline wrote itself at industry galas and cocktail lounges. They can't even maintain what we sell them, and now they think they can innovate. But behind the mockery, in classified chambers buried beneath London, Langley, and Paris, the tone was shifting. Satellite imagery showed new heat signatures, activity in abandoned buildings in Ouagadougou. Radio intercepts detected strange frequencies, encrypted, local, airborne. And then came the worst headline a Western analyst could read. Unidentified aerial vehicles detected. Presumed domestic origin. Capabilities unknown. Recommend immediate assessment. France, Burkina Faso's former colonizer and longtime puppeteer, moved first. Within days, a diplomatic delegation arrived in Ouagadougou. Officially, it was about trade. Unofficially, they were there to snoop. They brought gifts, offers of renewed cooperation, financial support, whispered promises of lifting the very sanctions they had imposed. But what they really wanted was access, to see with their own eyes what had come out of those underground workshops. Their top operative posed as a cultural attaché, but espionage was his real craft. Fluent, polished, dressed like a character from a GQ editorial, he arranged a quiet meeting with one of the drone engineers, a 23-year-old named Abu. Brilliant, underpaid, supporting a family of 6. He looked like an easy target. They met in a cafe mimicking a Parisian bistro, overpriced lattes, mismatched furniture, and a room filled with the sound of Western pretense. "You're wasting your genius here," the operative said smoothly, sliding a business card across the table. "In Europe, you'd have real labs, real budgets. You wouldn't be soldering wires with salvaged parts and praying your batteries hold." He leaned in. "We know about Sira, and we're impressed. You're capable of so much more than this provincial fantasy." Abu listened, polite but unreadable, sipping his lukewarm tea. The operative painted a seductive future: funding, labs, journal features, international acclaim, escape, comfort, belonging. And yet, there was something beneath it all, a shadow of condescension. This wasn't about empowering Abu. It was about removing him, silencing the spark before it became a fire. Abu set his tea down. "I appreciate the offer," he said calmly, "but I already have what I need." The operative's mask cracked. "Everything you need? Look around. You're in a cafe pretending to be France, in a country pretending to be sovereign. You're building toys from trash, powered by car batteries and patched-up prayers. What exactly do you think you're achieving?" Abu reached into his pocket and pulled out a beat-up smartphone. The screen was cracked. The casing was held together with tape, but it worked. He tapped the screen. A drone came into view, flying high, scanning vast stretches of green farmland, stable, clear, precise. "This," he said quietly, "was built by people who know the difference between dependence and dignity, between imitation and true innovation." He stood, placed a few bills on the table for the tea, and looked the operative dead in the eye. "Thank you for the coffee, and for reminding me why we build what we build." Then he walked away. The operative didn't chase. He made a call. And just like that, the situation escalated. Within hours, intelligence circles across the Western world shifted their posture. This wasn't some garage experiment. This wasn't hobbyists playing with electronics. This was the beginning of a challenge to the global technological order, led by a nation the world thought it had already subdued. And suddenly, Burkina Faso was no longer on the periphery of global power. It was rewriting the rules. While Western analysts debated and dismissed, the underground workshops in Ouagadougou never slept. The success of the first drone hadn't just sparked innovation, it had uncaged generations of suppressed potential. For the first time, engineers who had been told their only role was to consume, not create, felt the thrill of building something truly their own. And they didn't stop. The second prototype, Sira 2.0, was more than an upgrade. It was a declaration. It featured improved battery efficiency, sleeker aerodynamics, and a more sophisticated camera that could stream high-definition footage across vast distances. But the real breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A former math teacher, once silenced by education cuts, now driving a taxi, had been quietly developing an idea. She'd been working on hybrid navigation algorithms that didn't rely solely on GPS, which could easily be jammed or spoofed in a conflict zone. Her system merged satellite data with inertial guidance, visual checkpoints, and even magnetic field readings. If GPS was blocked, the drone could still navigate. If visibility dropped, magnetic and inertial systems kept it stable. A multi-layered navigation model, forged not in corporate labs, but on a salvaged laptop rescued from a landfill. Elegant, resilient, unstoppable. When President Traoré heard the news, he didn't summon reporters or order medals. He simply showed up, unannounced, as usual, tea in hand, slipping into the workshop as he always did. No guards, no fanfare. Just a leader deeply engaged in the work of liberation. "Show me," he said. That night, Sira 2.0 launched from an improvised runway, an empty lot repurposed into a makeshift airfield. The flight path was bold, a sweeping circuit over the city and surrounding villages, designed to test the new navigation system under real pressure. Midway through the flight, operators initiated GPS jamming. In most drones, this would spell disaster, but not this time. Sira 2.0 barely flinched. The system transitioned seamlessly to visual recognition. It scanned for pre-programmed landmarks, a uniquely shaped building, a river bend, a signature pattern of roads. Where other systems would spiral into confusion, Sira adjusted, quietly, confidently. Inside the command center, all eyes were glued to the screens. Live footage streamed in with crystal clarity. The drone maintained its course, steady, unshaken. President Traoré watched in silence. Not as a politician, as a witness to a deeper truth, that this moment wasn't about machines. It was about reclaiming narrative. This was living proof that technological dependence had always been a myth designed to maintain global hierarchies. When the drone returned safely, the workshop erupted. Engineers who had gone weeks without proper rest embraced, laughed, cried. What they'd built was more than a drone. It was a beacon, a message to every young mind across the continent. You can build your future from your own soil. But their moment of celebration was brief. Western intelligence agencies had been watching. Satellites had flagged strange activity. Intercepted signals had triggered red alerts. They knew drones were being developed, but they didn't yet understand what kind of system was taking shape beneath their radar. They were about to find out. In the early hours of a quiet morning, a convoy of vehicles crossed into Burkina Faso's northern region. No announcement, no coordination. A probing mission, just enough to gauge border defenses, test response times, and gather data. What the convoy didn't know was that Sira 3.0 had been in the sky for 2 weeks. This latest model was nothing like its predecessors. It had longer flight time, stronger stealth coding, improved AI, and, for the first time, full autonomous capability. Its onboard systems detected the convoy almost instantly. Infrared sensors picked up multiple heat signatures. Terrain mapping tools flagged the movement as irregular. The drone's neural network, trained on local vehicle patterns, classified the incursion as a potential threat. It began tracking. Back in the command center, a quiet ping alerted the duty officer. On screen, A real-time feed. High-resolution video, vehicle count, speed, route projections, overlays and path predictions that rivaled any NATO-grade system, at a fraction of the cost. President Traoré was woken, but not surprised. They had prepared for this. The test flights weren't just engineering trials. They were a trap, a challenge, a signal to the world. "We see you, we built this, and we're ready." Options? President Traoré stood motionless, eyes fixed on the live drone feed as Sirah's camera tracked the convoy. "We can follow them indefinitely," the operator replied. "They don't know we're watching. We can log movements, intercept comms, if they're on open radio, and track them wherever they go." Traoré didn't respond immediately. He knew there was more. "Or?" he asked quietly. The operator hesitated. "Targeting systems are fully operational. If we choose to, we can engage." That was the moment, the pivot point. Not just for the drone program, but for Burkina Faso's entire posture on the world stage. They had the power to strike, to prove, with force, that they were no longer defenseless. But using it would be a point of no return. It would confirm the worst fears of foreign powers, that African nations could not only innovate but retaliate, that their dependency was over. "No," Traoré said calmly but firmly. "We observe, we record. Let them know we see them, but we don't fire, unless they threaten our people." It wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. The real power of Sirah wasn't its ability to destroy. It was its ability to see, to capture irrefutable truth. In an age where perception shapes policy more than facts, information wasn't just a weapon, it was the battlefield. For 6 hours, Sirah hovered above the convoy, silent, invisible, omniscient. Every movement, every vehicle swap, every equipment deployment was documented in stunning detail. And then, the shift. Something changed. The convoy tightened formation. Radio chatter surged. Soldiers began scanning the skies, pulling out portable detection gear, rudimentary, rushed, and already too late. They knew. They were being watched. But they couldn't see what was watching them. Sirah was too high, too quiet. Its infrared signature masked, its acoustic profile engineered for silence. The work of engineers who had reverse-engineered the blind spots in Western detection systems and turned them into invisibility. And when the operation concluded, the footage that Sirah returned wasn't just a surveillance record. It was a bombshell. A full documentation of a covert incursion, recorded, archived, time-stamped. It showed a developing nation under economic siege deploying indigenous technology that rivaled NATO-grade systems. And then, without warning, the footage leaked. No one claimed credit. No government confirmed or denied. But within 48 hours, it had appeared on intelligence forums, military chat groups, and eventually, global news feeds. And the world changed. In Western defense circles, the reaction was immediate and volatile. Debates erupted across think tanks and classified meetings. How could a country under sanctions build drones this advanced? How had they developed a system for autonomous navigation, real-time surveillance, and stealth characteristics using nothing but salvaged parts and local knowledge? The implications were staggering and terrifying to the old world order. Because this wasn't just a drone. It was proof. Proof that innovation wasn't the property of the powerful. That with enough resolve, a so-called developing nation could leapfrog decades of dependency and build its own future. And worse, for them, it raised the question: if Burkina Faso could do this, who else might be next? The panic spread quickly. Diplomatic pressure intensified. Sanctions were tightened even further, especially on anything that might be used in drone technology. Intelligence agencies swept across the continent, desperate to uncover similar programs. And in Brussels, a special European Union summit was convened. On paper, the meeting was about responsible technology transfer and regional stability. But the subtext was unmistakable. African nations must remain consumers of technology, not creators of alternatives. The resolution was veiled in diplomatic language, full of phrases like cooperative development and international oversight. But its purpose was clear: to prevent a repeat of what had just occurred. And yet, in their haste, they made a strategic blunder of historic proportions. By treating African innovation as a threat, the old powers confirmed the very narrative they had tried to suppress: that the global hierarchy was afraid because the balance was shifting. And in the underground workshops of Ouagadougou, the engineers who once soldered wires under flickering lights knew one thing for certain. They had just proven that the future could be built from below. The reaction across Africa was immediate and electric. In Dar es Salaam, university students launched drone-building competitions using nothing but recycled parts and local materials. In Nairobi, research institutions formed new alliances with engineers in Ouagadougou, sharing breakthroughs and refining code. Venture capital networks quietly emerged, not to chase Silicon Valley copycats, but to fund technology designed for independence, not dependence. The success of Burkina Faso's drone program had done something that decades of speeches and development summits had failed to achieve. It had lit a fire. What began in the underground workshops of a sanctioned nation was now being replicated in Kinshasa, in Accra, in Lusaka, in Addis. The techniques, the philosophy, the attitude of defiance. It was spreading faster than any diplomatic cable could trace. President Traoré suddenly found himself at the center of something much larger than a national defense strategy. The drone initiative, once a survival response to Western economic strangulation, had become a symbol of something deeper: technological sovereignty. Requests began pouring in, not just from Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Myanmar. Nations long treated as peripheral were reaching out, eager to learn how a so-called poor country had achieved what wealthier ones had failed to even imagine. The Burkina Faso Drone Command soon evolved far beyond military applications. In the north, drones surveyed farmland, scanning for pest outbreaks and soil conditions, giving real-time insights that tripled crop yields and slashed pesticide use. In the south, environmental drones tracked illegal logging and deforestation with unmatched precision. In cities and rural areas alike, drones inspected bridges, monitored power grids, and mapped infrastructure, tasks that once required costly foreign consultants and equipment. Every new use case proved the same core principle: locally developed technology, built with indigenous expertise and available resources, wasn't just viable, it was superior. But the most profound shift was psychological. A generation of young Africans who had grown up believing that real innovation came from elsewhere, from the West, from imported labs, from white-coated experts in distant cities, were now seeing something radical: their own genius. The engineers in Ouagadougou became folk heroes, not because they copied Western systems, but because they built different systems, smarter ones, cheaper ones, stronger ones. Western media didn't know what to make of it. Coverage focused on the makeshift nature of the workshops, the scrap parts, the lack of formal training. The subtext was clear: this is impressive for Africa, but it's not a threat, a novelty, not a revolution. But they misunderstood what was happening. The Ouagadougou engineers weren't trying to mimic Western drones using cheaper parts. They were rethinking the problem entirely. The solutions they were building weren't bootleg imitations. They were elegant alternatives. Take the navigation system. While military contractors poured billions into vulnerable, GPS-dependent systems, a former math teacher in Burkina Faso had created a distributed model using visual landmarks, magnetics, and inertial tracking. It was fault-tolerant, unjammable, and totally independent of external infrastructure. This pattern repeated across the program. Power systems that fused solar panels, lightweight batteries, and ultra-efficient motors. No fuel, no combustion, no logistical bottlenecks. communications networks that used multiple frequency bands and rotating encryption, harder to jam, harder to track. Manufacturing processes that combined 3D-printed components, hand tools, and local materials to create high-precision results without expensive factories. And all of it, was affordable. That was perhaps the most terrifying part for the established defense industry. These drones didn't cost millions. They cost thousands. Not only were they effective, they were scalable, mass-producible, accessible. And in an industry built on artificial scarcity and bloated procurement budgets, this was nothing short of heresy. Defense giants responded with the only tools they had left: dismissal, disinformation, denial. They seeded doubt, too simple to be reliable. Impressive, but not real military tech. Cheaper must mean inferior. But the leaked border surveillance footage silenced much of that noise. Because the world had seen it. The clarity, the stability, the range, the detail. Not theoretical, not simulated. Real-world performance that rivaled Western systems at a fraction of the cost. And that's when the deeper fear set in. This wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a paradigm shift. Because this kind of innovation couldn't be stopped with export bans or patent law. It didn't live in fragile trade agreements. It wasn't tied to global supply chains. It was born in basements, in backyards, in minds no longer waiting for permission. And for the first time in decades, the world's most powerful institutions were asking a terrifying question. What if the future isn't coming from us anymore? Patent restrictions, export controls, technology transfer bans. For decades, these had been the tools of control. Guardrails designed to keep the global south on the receiving end of innovation, to make sure that cutting-edge systems stayed exactly where they were meant to, in the hands of a few powerful nations. But Burkina Faso had broken that model, not by stealing technology, not by copying it, but by reimagining the process itself. Their approach was something the global system wasn't built to handle. Distributed innovation, powered by open-source thinking, salvaged materials, and human ingenuity. There were no blueprints to secure, no patents to enforce, no factories to bomb. The knowledge was spreading across borders in the quietest way possible, person to person, engineer to engineer, WhatsApp groups, flash drives, crumpled notebooks passed between friends. What emerged wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a movement. A model of technological proliferation that evolved organically, not under the direction of governments or corporations, but through the hands and minds of people who had nothing to lose and everything to invent. And that model was fundamentally incompatible with the assumptions that had underpinned global power since World War II. The post-war order had been built on a singular premise: that advanced technology would always remain concentrated in a handful of rich, industrialized nations, who would use that edge to dictate terms, control trade, and police the future. But now a country under sanctions with no formal tech sector and no foreign investment had built surveillance drones from junkyard scraps and made them work. Better still, they were inspiring others. Solar panels built from local minerals, water purification systems tailored to the region, internet-free communication networks built on radio mesh, farm equipment designed for rugged terrains and easy repair. Every new breakthrough echoed the same message: we don't need permission to innovate. And with each success, the walls of dependency cracked. President Traoré understood this wasn't about drones anymore. It was about imagination. It was about erasing limits that had been written in colonial ink and redrawn by corporate cartels. The engineers who once soldered wires in underground workshops were now mentors, teachers, trainers. They had become the nucleus of an entirely new model of innovation, one that didn't rely on billion-dollar campuses or foreign grants, but on sweat, resilience, and belief. Ouagadougou became a quiet mecca for young African technologists. They didn't come for luxury or fame. They came to see what it looked like when necessity became invention, and when invention wasn't gated by money or privilege. They left with more than knowledge. They left with a different question echoing in their minds. What if we were never behind, just told to believe we were? That shift in mindset was the real revolution. The ripple effect spread across the continent. University lectures changed, curricula evolved. Professors who once taught imported theories began championing local ingenuity. Entrepreneurs who once sought Silicon Valley's approval started looking inward, finding value in local challenges, building local solutions. But the deepest transformation was cultural. The Burkina Faso drone project didn't just challenge the world's assumptions about Africa, it challenged Africa's assumptions about itself. For generations, the story had been fixed. Africa as a consumer, a market, a follower. But here was proof, undeniable flying proof, that Africa could create, not in imitation, not in desperation, but in leadership. Young people across the global south were asking new questions. If Burkina Faso could build world-class surveillance drones under sanctions, what could we build in Dhaka, in La Paz, in Nairobi, in the Amazon? And more importantly, what's stopping us, except the belief that we can't? From remote villages in India to island nations in the Pacific, the Burkina Faso model was being studied, adapted, implemented. Not for profit, but for sovereignty. Because the real threat to the global status quo wasn't just the technology, it was the idea behind it. That innovation didn't need billion-dollar labs. That technological superiority wasn't hereditary. That genius wasn't colonial. And that the North-South divide in science and technology was a myth, propped up by money, media, and control. The defense industry saw what was coming. If countries could produce drones for a fraction of the cost, if they could design communication networks immune to foreign interference, if they could create tools tailored for their own terrain, their own needs, their own people, then the old monopolies weren't just threatened, they were obsolete. And the very architecture of international influence, built on exclusive access to tools of power, was beginning to fracture. Because this time the innovation wasn't centralized, it wasn't for sale, and it couldn't be contained. It had already escaped. But what was unfolding in those workshops extended far beyond military hardware. The same spirit, the same relentless ingenuity that had birthed Africa's first domestically engineered surveillance drones was now being applied across sectors: renewable energy, healthcare, education, agriculture, and manufacturing. It wasn't just innovation, it was renaissance. And for the first time in generations, it was happening on African terms, using African resources, solving African problems, led by African minds. No foreign consultants, no imported blueprints, no one waiting for permission. What emerged from this groundswell wasn't a cheap imitation of Western tech. It was something else entirely: original, elegant, efficient, local, and more often than not, better. Because the success wasn't measured in press releases or defense expos. It was measured in results. The drones flew. The intelligence systems delivered actionable data. The agricultural tools raised yields. The infrastructure monitors flagged risks before they became disasters. The water systems purified. The solar panels powered homes. And all of it worked, with equipment that had been dismissed as scrap and minds that had been dismissed as unqualified. Across the global south, something shifted. The Burkina Faso model was no longer viewed as an anomaly. It was becoming a blueprint. Universities rewrote curricula to emphasize real-world problem-solving over theoretical mimicry. Research centers redirected their focus toward hyperlocal innovation. Governments stopped signing one-sided tech transfer deals and started investing in their own people. What had held for decades, imported solutions for exported dependence, was unraveling. Where there were once consumers, now stood creators. Where supply chains had run outward, new networks of regional production and repair were taking shape. And where multinationals had once monopolized entire industries, local innovators were breaking in with cheaper, smarter, more adaptable solutions. President Ibrahim Traoré watched the movement evolve beyond even his boldest expectations. What began as a quiet act of defiance under economic siege had become proof, visible, irrefutable proof, that technological independence was not only possible, it was inevitable. Inside the Ouagadougou workshops, the mission had expanded. Beyond drones, teams were developing solar technologies tailored to the Sahel climate, healthcare monitors that didn't rely on internet connectivity, radio-based communication systems immune to blackouts, and agricultural machines that could be fixed with hand tools and local parts. And each project carried the same DNA. Build with what you have. Design for the real world. Make it simple, make it work, then teach someone else how to do it. The impact on the regional economy was profound. Imports fell, local industries grew, foreign contractors, long considered indispensable, were being replaced by homegrown engineers and entrepreneurs. Supply chains that had once stretched across oceans were now looping through local cooperatives and regional trade networks. But the deepest impact wasn't economic. It was psychological. A generation of Africans who had grown up believing innovation was something that happened elsewhere, that real tech came with a foreign flag, were now watching peers build world-class systems from the ground up, and they were asking the most dangerous question of all. If we could do this, what else have we been told we can't? Enrollment in engineering and science surged. Entrepreneurs turned inward, finding purpose in solving problems just outside their doors. Governments that had once begged for access began defending their own capacity. And through it all, the drone program stood as a symbol of what was possible, not just in machines, but in minds. The international press tried to downplay the story, emphasizing the makeshift tools, the lack of formal training, the so-called primitive conditions. But that was the point. This wasn't a story about building tech despite scarcity. It was about redefining what resourcefulness could achieve when liberated from dependency. The navigation breakthrough by a former math teacher, the energy systems using recycled batteries and solar hybrids, the communications networks built without a single imported chip. Each invention chipped away at the myth that complexity required wealth and reaffirmed that creativity thrives under pressure. And perhaps most dangerously for global corporations, it was all affordable. The drones didn't cost millions. The infrastructure tools didn't require foreign aid. The energy systems didn't need rare earth imports. They were sustainable, scalable, and sovereign, which meant the old business models, based on artificial scarcity and billion-dollar price tags, were suddenly looking very fragile. Burkina Faso hadn't just innovated. It had freed innovation from its cage. Patent systems, export restrictions, and licensing controls couldn't stop this kind of proliferation. The knowledge moved through people, not paperwork, through hands and hearts, not supply chains. This was technology that could not be embargoed, and the movement was spreading. In rural India, open-source water filtration systems modeled on the Burkina Faso approach. In Bolivia, local mesh networks bypassing the need for big telecoms. In the Pacific Islands, modular solar grids inspired by Ouagadougou's rooftop labs. They weren't just copying, they were iterating, improving, localizing. And in every corner of the world once written off as developing, a quiet revolution was taking root. The story that began with sanctions and soldering irons had grown into a global reckoning. A reminder that innovation has never belonged to empires. It belongs to anyone who dares to try. And at the center of it stood a young president with no golden palace, no foreign sponsors, just a belief that dignity is built, not granted. They built walls to keep him small. He built wings instead. And now an entire continent was learning to fly.